Likely place to be the possible cockpit of a second Cold War, a quintessentially English country town, immortalised by Trollope, painted by Constable, a city only by virtue of its cathedral, certainly the tallest, arguably the prettiest in England. The attempted murder of a Russian double agent and his daughter in the shadow of that high cathedral spire has created a crisis in Anglo-Russian relations, a new tension between Moscow and the West that echoes the nuclear standoff generations ago, and a moral dilemma for us in how best to respond. That Moscow was behind the attack, though unproven, seems highly likely given the method and the ambiguous half-denials from Russian officials. There are unanswered questions. Why target an ex-spy so long after his betrayal? Why use a military-grade nerve agent when a sandbag and a quick push into the River Avon would have been so much more discreet, so much easier to disown? Somebody clearly wanted to make a point. So what do? We've chucked out their more dubious diplomats, they've chucked out ours. What now? Stop the Royals going to the Russian World Cup? That'll show them, I suppose. But in deterrence terms, it's a few steps short of mutually assured destruction. We could impose more sanctions, target leading Russians, their interests, their money. In the Cold War, at least we knew where we stood. 30 years on, what's the right way to stand up to aggression without going back to it? That's our Moral Maze tonight. Our panel, Anne McElvoy, senior editor at The Economist, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Michael Portillo, and the Chief Executive of the RSA, Matthew Taylor, and the priest and polemicist Giles Fraser. Anne, you're an old Moscow hand. Not old, of course, certainly not. Experienced.
Middle-aged Moscow hand. I was there during the rise of Vladimir Putin in the 1990s, and I think we've just, we've really seen Putin, in a sense, go from being an old KGB operator to, in some senses, harks back to the Cold War, to being a particularly modern kind of authoritarian leader who is very capable of understanding the West's weaknesses and very capable of exploiting them. And in the criticisms of the response to the Skripal case, we're seeing a lot of that. That's what I want to dig into tonight.
Giles Fraser?
Well, I don't have this sort of experience, and I really want to listen to what people have to say tonight, but it seems to me that Jeremy Corbyn was right, that due process hasn't really been followed, and we can't say anything's been proven at all. I don't really know what we can do that's going to make a difference, or perhaps even make things worse, but like this I do feel that we're spectacularly self-righteous when it comes to the Russians.
Michael Portillo, former Defence Secretary, of course.
Well, when a Russian chemical weapon is deployed in a British city, I don't see how the UK government can do anything less than expel 23 Russian diplomats. I don't have any fear of this degenerating into war, but I think things are going to be somewhere between cool and cold between us and Russia, because I think it's pretty hard to see how we can warmly embrace what is effectively a mafia state.
Matthew Taylor.
Yeah, I think Russia did it, and I think we were right to act and to rally our allies. But I also think that even in these very troubling times, we still need to try to build a better, more moral world order.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Mark Rice-Oxley, who's head of special projects at The Guardian newspaper, former Moscow correspondent for Agence France-Presse. In print, anyway, you seem to be all for getting really pretty tough with Putin. We'll find out exactly how in a moment. You're not bothered we're risking returning to a Cold War?
Well, I think we're actually back in a Cold War. I think we have been for a number of years. I think even before Salisbury, relations had been going from bad to worse. I think even before Salisbury, there's a very strong case for tougher action against Putin and his clan, his entourage, whatever you want to call them, the people who are leading, one of the world's most important and most fabulous countries. Let's not forget Russia is a marvellous place. We've got lots of Russian friends.
And Giles Fraser.
So this is a moral programme, not a foreign policy programme.
Sure.
So my question is, how do we challenge aggression without repeating it?
I think there are more tools now available than ever before for doing that. I think the 20th century way was to meet power or might with might, and that's why we ended up in so many wars. I think in the 21st century, we've got lots of deft tools at our disposal. I think that we've talked about the money. It's very tricky, arcane business as to how to choke off Russian money. But I think what we have to do with someone like Vladimir Putin is hit him where it hurts. I think here is a man who is vain. I think we need to attack his prestige. Here is a man who is buttressed by money. I think we need to attack the money men around him. When I say attack, I mean we need to confront. And we have these new tools at our disposal, unexplained unsigned wealth orders. I think you'll see a lot of those being used to try and choke off the money men around Vladimir Putin. I think there are golden visas that we've introduced to make it easy for Russians to launder their money in London. I think these are all methods that we can use to confront, but not to attack.
He's not going to be quaking in his boots over what you just said, is he?
I think he will, because what supports Putin, what keeps him in power, is the support of this coterie of very rich, very powerful people around him. And I think if they're starting to be less rich, if they're starting to be undermined, then they go into the office and they say, look, Vova, we need to do something about this.
You've called for an information counter-offensive. Do you think Cambridge Analytica could help us with that?
Yeah, I knew I'd get into trouble when I said that, because I seem to be advocating the very thing that we've been criticising the Russians for.
Absolutely right.
That said, I think it's probably happening already. I think that, again, I'd rather we adopted soft power and told the Russians, these are our values, this is what society can be like. You have a tremendous amount of wealth, of human capital at your fingertips. We need to release that. Don't be cowed by the bullies in charge of your country. Release that capability.
There is this problem, isn't there, that something happens where there isn't much we can do about it, really, but for the politicians, they need to look like they're doing something. So there's a great deal of showy stuff that you get from Boris and so forth, which is all rubbish, really.
I have a big problem with that. I think that we should be confronting by saying nothing. I think that the best way to confront is to take some of these actions I've mentioned, but don't say anything about it, because that, A, the Russians will soon pick up on it, and B, you need to give Putin a chance to have a graceful exit. If you confront him and corner him, of course he will fight back.
Matthew Turner?
It seems to me that one of the differences about what's happening now to the kind of relationship we had with Russia when I was growing up was that we assumed in that latter case that the Russians were victims of their government. They were oppressed, and if only their government went, then they would want to work with us. We don't assume that anymore, do we? Despite the fact that obviously there's chicanery going on, it looks like most Russian people are supportive of their
I still think that they are victims. Were you referring to the late Soviet period or the Boris Yeltsin period? The Soviet period, yeah. I think we're in a similar situation. I think they've got a terrible government. They've got terrible leadership that's annexed all the wealth of the country for a very few people. I think if you get outside...
So do you think Putin's support... I mean, as I say, I'm sure there was manipulation of the polls, but I've seen legitimate opinion polls which suggest he's pretty popular.
But if we had only one TV channel here that only spoke about how great Theresa May was, her ratings would go up too. That's the situation you have. So, I mean, it's not difficult to be popular.
So how do we... You've talked about soft power. How do we break through to the Russian people, given that there isn't much sign that they're going to rise up or rebel? I mean, obviously he's using the power of the state.
Well, we have to use the same digital technologies that have been used against us, but to do so in an open way. There are ways and means of writing. I'm a journalist. This is what I would like to do. I love it when we translate our articles into Russian and we can see 5,000 or 10,000 Russians have read them. That's better than nothing, and that's where it starts.
So can real news counter fake news?
Yeah, of course it can. We have to believe that. We have to believe that at the end of the day, the truth will stick and the fake news will kind of fritter away at the edges.
So there shouldn't be tit for tat, because tit for tat would be we'd be lobbing as much fake news at them as they are lobbing at us.
We have to be true to our values, and that means we have to try. I mean, what is the truth? It's hard to approximate to the truth, but I've spent 25 years trying to do it. Haven't always got it right, but I'd like to keep trying to write about the things that are great about our society and our values and our civilizations, and hope that can reach some people.
So to clarify, if the Russians were to do something which goes beyond what we've seen so far, which was an unjustifiable act, you don't think that we should respond in kind? We should actually show stoicism in the face of that.
We're getting...
So if you get like the British Council versus Russia Today, for example, you think we should say, well, okay, well, you might want to close down cultural links, but we're going to keep them open.
We shouldn't close down Russia Today. We absolutely shouldn't close down Russia Today. We're strong enough and confident enough. So there's an element of
this which is trying to keep the moral high ground.
Yeah, absolutely, because I think we're lost if we don't. And there's one other thing I'd like to suggest. We should pull our team out of the World Cup, and we should pull half a dozen European teams. We should persuade our European partners to come and have a clean World Cup, no FIFA, no Russia, in Western Europe this summer, and all the profits should go to charitable endeavours.
We still wouldn't win, though.
It doesn't matter. Not all about the winning.
Only if
About the
everybody else
taking
pulls
part.
out. Mark Rice-Oxley, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Sir Simon Jenkins, journalist, political commentator, former editor of The Times, of course, now to be read most often in The Guardian, and books like Mission Accomplished, The Crisis of International Intervention, which is in this area. In The Guardian, anyway, and we do read other papers at the BBC, believe me. You've been, sometimes, where you've been pretty sniffy about taking a belligerent line with Moscow.
I just can't see the point. I mean, this whole conversation so far has had we at the subject of the sentence, as if we are responsible for Russia in some curious way. They do things like kill their people abroad if they don't like them. We do something of that sort as well. I mean, we kill people with drones in Syria if we don't like them. I hate hypocrisy in foreign policy, but I don't see any virtue that comes out of overreacting. We have to do something. I totally accept that when something like this happens on the streets of Salisbury. But to call it war on our soil, as the Prime Minister did, is absurd. And what's the point of saying it? I mean, in a sense, make hysterical all foreign policy. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the Russians. It doesn't help us. We have no interest in Cold War with Russia again. It's a desperate, pathetic country. It's not safe altogether. But it doesn't bother me. It's not attacking me. It's not upsetting me. I don't feel responsible for it. I just rather like to see good relations with everybody.
Michael Turner?
If you were the Prime Minister, do you think you could possibly not have responded, let's say, by expelling 23 diplomats, to the use of a chemical weapon in a British city?
No, I think that was a proportionate response.
Good. So
that's not a war, though.
So your problem is with the language, not with anything that the government has done so far.
It's with the language.
Yeah.
It really. I mean,
but if you think that language is exaggerated, do you not think your article that began with the sentence, "Do we really want war with Russia?" Do you not think that was an exaggeration?
It was a response to the Prime Minister saying we are in a state of war with Russia.
There's no prospect for a war with Russia, is there? You and I can agree on that.
No. So what is the point of this sort of language? This is a messy crime on the streets of London. That's
Right.
what it was.
So your only point
Salisbury, in this case.
Salisbury.
Your only point is about language. But then you also wrote that the British response, if I understood you, to the chemical weapon attack in Salisbury, that the British response could be a Sarajevo.
Well,
that was an exaggeration, wasn't it?
I was drawing a parallel with other individual responses, which at the time people thought were insignificant. And I'm simply saying that by building up these events...
Sounds like you want to row back from your parallel. Would you like to do that? This is not a Sarajevo, is it?
We don't know yet. We don't know yet. I'm sure at the time people thought it was. Now, I'm reluctant to draw glib historical parallels, and with that, from that withdraw. But I mean, that's not my point. My point was...
It just seems to me that if you exaggerate, you encourage others to exaggerate. I mean, it's difficult to criticise the British government for exaggerating if you're exaggerating.
Well, I don't think I'm exaggerating in that sense. I'm making a point about a historical event which was at the time thought insignificant, but it triggered a sequence of events that produced the First World War. Now, I just think we ought to always be on our guard against events that have that consequence.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you said that the expulsion of 23 diplomats was perfectly reasonable.
I think, on balance, it was. I think I'd have waited a bit. I mean, the evidence for so doing was, as yet, fairly skimpy.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, am I allowed to?
One more, Mike.
One more. Another thing you seem to think is that, you know, the embrace that NATO and the European Union gave to the former Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe and in the Baltic, that this was in some way a provocation. Is it really your view that these poor people who have been under the Jap boot for 45 years, that when they appealed to us for some security, for some underpinning of their new democracy, that this was unreasonable in some way?
Yes, I agree. That I did not think was an exaggerated historical parallel. It seemed to me that literally to move your troops forward to the border of a state that was your enemy across what had been regarded as semi-neutral territory was a provocation, so described by Yeltsin, and rightly so. It was the sort of thing we did to the Germans before. It was not a wise thing to do, and I think it was a catastrophic error, in fact.
Emma Kelboy?
I don't recognise that description. I mean, sitting there, you've seen, most of that time, Simon, including, writing columns for you when you're editing the Times after the Cold War. What happened was we tried to work out security architecture. We've had a sort of, only after the incursion into Ukraine and Crimea, a commitment of revolving garrisons. I mean, where is this idea coming from that we have moved our troops to the borders of Russia, and that is, in a sense, sort of a moral problem?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure morality comes into it, but
I hope so.
If we could get some in, we'd be really happy.
Morality in foreign policy is always a vexed issue. But at the time, you had a very vulnerable, humiliated Russia, as you know well. You had a leadership all over the shop. They were frightened about what might happen next. The rapidity with which NATO and the EU
did what?
Well, they welcomed. They invited and welcomed the frontline states, so to speak. But to do that...
What you're calling the frontline states were countries which you had their independence. And I'm afraid I'm going to come back to the moral category. Yeah. There is, I mean, we can argue about, territory and states and, what constitutes a state, but don't you see any sort of ethical claim that they had to freedom, just not to put a very simple word on it?
Freedom is one thing. Joining the former enemies of the regime that they're next to is a different thing. And that's what they were doing. They were being invited to join us. And not just invited, they were being quite strongly pressed.
Well, you have the Baltic states in it.
But much more serious with Ukraine. NATO opened offices in Kiev. They actually pressed the Ukrainians to join, knowing that was a very, very dangerous thing to do.
It seems to me that the moral balance for you is always, or the practical end of the moral balance is, never take a risk with Russia. Do you not think that it leads to, and point for point on this country, this move, that move in foreign affairs, but it leads to a sort of a shrunken position, really, by a Western power, where you only anything that is seen to annoy Russia must be foolish, and one can say this with some, this Olympian grandeur. But actually, anything else is just out of the question because other people's moral rights don't matter.
Well, you are saying it with Olympian grandeur.
I'm trying,
and I don't agree with it. I mean, I think the victor in a war, and we were the winners of the Cold War, owe some obligation of humility and generosity to the defeated. And at this time, we did the opposite. We really did, so to speak, go for them. And it was a very stupid thing to do. And I still think Putin is benefiting from that. It's strengthening Russia with the way we did it. It was reckless, it was unwise, and we may well pay for it.
You don't think you might just be being, or people who hold this view, just being a bit vain? It may not all be about us. It might be much more about the failure of Russia to come to terms with the end of communism.
The failures of Russia are palpable. The question is, what is our responsibility to try in some sense and sympathise with them rather than to be aggressive against them?
Sir Simon Jenkins, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Robert Service, who's Emeritus Professor of Russian History at St Antony's, Oxford, and currently writing a book about Putin's Russia since 2012. What do you think's going on in Moscow, and what should we do about it?
Well, I think the story of Russia since 2000 has been a lurch into nationalism. And I think that Putin has let loose the dogs of nationalism, and it would be very difficult for any subsequent Russian ruler to put the dogs back in the kennel. He's played a dangerous game, I think, because he faced economic weaknesses as a result of the economic model that he set up, or that he inherited and didn't dismantle.
Matthew Taylor?
One of the things that we've said for decades, really, is a kind of sense of things will be better after. Things will be better after the war, things will be better after the Cold War, things will be better maybe even after the war on terror. Should we give up saying things will be better after and just accept that this is the way they are?
Well, I don't think we should give up on the Russian people. They've got a terrible set of rulers at the moment. I don't think we've been very good in the last week or two, by the way, in the way that we've handled this situation. We jumped out with conclusions before we presented the evidence. We didn't actually take British society, far less Russian society, into account.
So how do you if you think that we are in a kind of state of war in the sense of cyber warfare, ruthless espionage, this kind of intensity,
war is just a terrible word to use. We're not in a state of war.
Some kind of conflict, then, ongoing conflict. This isn't a one-off incident. You know, as you've said yourself, it's part of a pattern. How do you reconcile responding firmly to that behaviour with the need, as it were, to find some way of reaching out an arm to the Russian people themselves in the hope that they might one day choose a less belligerent form of leadership?
Well, we have the huge benefit of our successful soft power, which we ought to use more expansively than we do. The Russians tried it in reverse by setting up Ruski Mir institutes all around the world, and they blew it by what they did in Ukraine. They were getting somewhere with RT and Ruski Mir, and they blew it by their actions. So we've got to
move a bit wider from Russia, because I want to know whether there are any kind of grounds for hope, not just Russia, but the rise of nationalism all over the world, including in the US,
yes,
of course. How do things get better from this turn towards a more nationalistic, more belligerent world?
Well, I feel that a necessary step in the right direction would be a clarification of the terms of mutual engagement, so that the Russians know where not to step over.
And is there a moral dimension to that clarification, or is it just kind of logistical?
Well, there certainly is if you're an Estonian or a Latvian or a Lithuanian. I mean, the idea that somehow the NATO powers push those peoples into wanting to be involved in an alliance that would protect them is just historical poppycock. They begged to be involved with Europe. They begged to be involved with NATO. Clinton actually wasn't well persuaded of this in the 1990s. So let's get away from this idea that the Russians have always had reasons for feeling hurt. What we've got to do is to engage in the education of public opinion on both sides.
Giles Fraser?
Simon Jenkins says one of his lines about this is we've got to take the splinter out of our own eye. That we've been assassinating our own people in Syria, and that's an equivalence. And there's a great degree of self-righteousness about the way we talk about Russia. How do you react to that?
Well, as a country, we surely have to react against the assassination of British residents. Or
you're convinced it was Russians that it was Russian state that did it?
Well, I think the evidence has yet to be presented to us. I would hope that the evidence will come to light a lot sooner than it did after the Litvinenko inquiry. That inquiry took 9 years to set up. Yeah. The successive governments really behaved incredibly irresponsibly.
But the point about sort of our sort of like self-righteousness about this, and the fact that we don't have an unblemished record in our dealings with people abroad. We take their money. The Russians. We're often up to the same tricks.
I think this is a particularly spectacular attempted assassination that goes beyond anything that I know of in Russia by our side. I mean, the fact is, people don't go to Russia seeking asylum in the same way that they do come to Britain. There is actually a moral difference here.
That's a good note to end on. Robert Service, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Our last witness is Dr. Rebecca Johnson, who's founding president of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. She's also executive director of the Acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy. And long ago in the 80s, she was heavily involved in the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. You've said, I think, that the British response to all this has left you with your head in your hands. Would you rather hug than scold the Kremlin?
Oh, absolutely not hug.
Right,
but
okay.
it's the lack of analysis. It's the lack of analysis into what is very dangerous.
Anne McElway?
Well, so much for the criticisms of the style and language. What about the content? Once you've got an analysis that satisfies you, what do you think the moral force of it should be?
Weapons, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. She's also executive director of the Acronym Institute for Disarmament Diplomacy. And long ago in the 80s, she was heavily involved in the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. You've said, I think, that the British response to all this has left you with your head in your hands. Would you rather hug than scold the Kremlin?
Oh, absolutely not hug.
Right,
but
okay.
it's the lack of analysis. It's the lack of analysis into what is real. How the New World Order, how the world order has changed, and how Britain has actually changed in that, and how Russia has changed. The lack of analysis about what Putin and his regime, what their objectives are, apart from regime survival, which clearly is the case, and he's now been re-elected for 6 years. Mustering, finger waving, the kind of Boris sort of making threats that are just really hot air. Very, very dangerous.
Anne McElway?
Well, so much for the criticisms of the style and language. What about the content? Once you've got an analysis that satisfies you, what do you think the moral force of it should be when it comes to dealing with Vladimir Putin?
Okay. I think, first of all, to understand what he's about, and also why he's popular, or why he appears to be popular in Russia. We see, big turnout and voters for him, and what that actually means.
What does it mean?
Well, I actually think it goes back to the asset stripping done directly after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
So you see it as an internal?
And it was, yes, very, very, very much so. People were made poor. They thought the West was going to hug them, open out to them, instead of which they did see, NATO moving in right to the edges. They saw rapacious companies, from Europe and also the US, actually moving in really to help, asset strip and to help enrich certain oligarchs that moved very swiftly to
seriously
get
saying that what happened in Russia after the fall of communism was more the fault of US and European companies than it was rapacious people in Russia?
Oh, rapacious people in Russia, absolutely, but they had partners. They absolutely had partners, and the Western governments didn't actually do anything to stem that. And then, of course, the whole Yeltsin episode, once Gorbachev had been moved aside, Yeltsin, and, the sense of humiliation.
Skip lightly over that,
okay,
because we're the
except
moral
we have to understand that Putin arose from that.
So what is the Western, specifically Western guilt here? And don't you worry that by the time we've listed all the things from various political viewpoints, and I think you clearly have one, that we think that we've done wrong, that there is something sort of deep in sort of the modern Western soul, which is better at actually just picking faults with ourselves and actually saying, this is wrong, we really need to do something about it.
Oh, I think there's a great deal wrong, and actually a lot that's very frightening about Putin's Russia. And, the strong arming, I think that he's a very skilled tactician, not necessarily a strategist, and certainly not a democratic politician, but, even though he manipulates democracy for his own ends.
So
now, how do we deal with someone who is prepared to see all the weaknesses in our countries, including this country, the UK, and then exploit them?
But surely you then have to be strong, and this is what I get the impression that you don't want to do. You've found lots of reasons, as Sam James, another witness tonight, why we might be at fault. good. That's self-critical, positive. But you, in the end, have to decide, don't you, that at some point you're going to stand up for Western values.
Yes,
Is that
you
okay?
are. You stand up for Western values, and you stand up strongly, but you do not do it by means of, for example, the threats or uses of military force, because that would be counterproductive. It would not reach your objectives. But, for example, some of the things that we
Never
could
use military force.
I didn't say never, but I absolutely said in this kind of a case, it would be absolutely counterproductive, and it would not achieve. It would actually play into Putin's hands. Now, there are things that we could do. Quite a number of Putin. You know, Putin gets benefits through the prestige as a strong man, through benefiting the cronies around him. So how do we, how do we target that? Also, through some of the industries where he and his cronies are profiting. A lot of those industries, actually, including also arms, rely on components. From the West, not only from the UK. So how are we building our alliances for a much stronger sanctions that actually choke off those components and those things that Putin and his allies want to benefit from.
Okay, Michael Portillo.
You're the founding president of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, so I suppose you do take a fairly dim view of the use of a chemical weapon in Salisbury.
Absolutely. I was a strong supporter of the Chemical Weapons Convention before it was even concluded, and I think that it was the right thing that we have brought in the OPCW, the Organisation of for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons Inspectors, to provide us with the evidence of exactly what was used, where it came from, and then we can look at the due process using international law. Don't forget, through chemical weapons being prohibited, actually any use is also a war crime and a crime against humanity and can be taken to The Hague.
A moment ago you talked about playing into Putin's hands. Supposing that expelling 23 diplomats does in a way play into Putin's hands, makes him more popular, helps him to win a bigger election, is that a good reason for not doing it?
You know, that expelling of the diplomatic really echoes the Cold War. It's somebody, I think, said it's a kind of dance of diplomacy. We see it happening. We expel 23, they expel 23. But then he's a poker player. He raised it and he closed down the British Council, which was very counterproductive.
So you would not have expelled any diplomats, is that right? You, who are the founding president of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, you would have not done anything at all when a chemical weapon was used in Salisbury.
I would
Am I understanding?
I would have certainly brought in the chemical weapons inspectors. I also would have given notice that, when we identify where the chemical weapons come from, we start a process to bring to The Hague whoever, and that's a whole chain of
process
command.
About as rapid as what happened after the assassination of Litvinenko.
It may not be a fast process, but I can tell you, for somebody like
how do we establish
Putin,
a moral position?
It could be an utterly humiliating process to find himself charged.
I must say,
let's
think
not
you're
forget
pretty
the Yugoslav leaders that ended up in The Hague. That was one of the worst things that we could have done to them, and it held them accountable individually and personally for what they did as leaders of their governments.
I imagine that you, who are heavily involved in the Greenland Common Women's Peace Camp, understand that if you'd done that in Russia, you would have found yourself in Siberia or dead.
Well, as a matter of fact,
and that you would not be now on the state broadcaster in Russia making the points you're making now.
We did travel many times. I took the Trans-Siberian from China, stopped at places. We also went in 1985.
No, of course, because you are undermining the West, not undermining Russia.
Moscow Trust Group, who were opposed to the regime at that time. And we worked hard to bring Gorbachev and Reagan to Reykjavik, and the result was a treaty that at least got rid of that level of the intermediate range nuclear forces, the Cruise, the Pershing, and the SS-20s. We were against all of them.
Dr. Johnson, thank you very much indeed. Okay, right. Now, we've got a lot to go for here, haven't we? Mark, right opposite the first, we're already in a Cold War. he said, not just risking the prospect of it. Overstatement, and a lot of overstatement tonight?
No, not an overstatement. I think we had a lot of discussion tonight about what is the wise language to use, so maybe we could parcel that up together for the sake of speed. So the other thing is, you can always find why things are different about history at different points, but I think we are in an ongoing multi-sided conflict now with Russia, of which the Skripal affair and the incursions into neighbouring countries outside Russia's borders are a part. I'm not as allergic to it as some people, but I think if it's just going to end up with an argument about names, then I'd probably rather call it something else.
I think his point, and he recognised it himself, that there was a danger that we, either he or others, or both, were advocating the very thing that we're accusing the Russians for. Giles, I put the golf ball on the tee. Just blast that into the.
Well, it seems to be. Actually, he was softer here than he is in print. Actually, Mark Rice Oxley was, but there is a way in which the machismo of Putin gets responded to with a sort of our own sort of machismo, and there's that sort of tit for tat thing which happens, which is why the language sort of matters. I mean, we're trying to be terribly sort of macho about it, but actually, it's a sort of Boris's macho is a sort of failed macho-ness. It doesn't really strike very true, and that seems to be the problem with the way in which we do this sort of tit for tat thing. I thought Mark was actually very measured, though, when he talked rather calmly about cutting off money supplies to oligarchs and that sort of thing, which seems to be exactly right.
It was quite interesting on the say nothing, his line about saying nothing and confront and not attack. But sorry, Matthew.
I think there's a kind of discursive tit for tat here, which is that you have a kind of fault line on both sides of the argument. So on one side, the fault line is between understanding and condoning. And so, I think when we were talking to Simon Jenkins, there was this, I think Anne pressed him hard on this, which is, it sounded sometimes in trying to understand the mentality of Putin and maybe the Russian people as a whole, that he was also condoning that mentality. So that's the kind of fault line there. How can you understand Putin, understand Russia? Because in the end, you have to try to understand anybody if you're going to kind of have a strategy towards them without looking as though you're condoning them. On the other side, it's a kind of difference between determination to do the right thing and act and kind of posturing and provocation of the kind of Boris kind that we've seen today, comparing Putin to Hitler. I mean, comparing people to Hitler is the laziest intellectual trope that you can possibly imagine. I can't believe that Foreign Secretary would do it. But nevertheless, both sides then kind of feed off each other as they conflate these things.
And Michael?
Well, from Hitler, I think I'm going to turn to Munich. In that, Simon Jenkins seemed to have this very lofty view that we could simply have allowed, the Baltic states and the East European countries to exist without security, without being embraced by NATO, without joining the European Union, so that their democracies could be underpinned. And I think that is an extraordinarily detached view. It clearly was their feeling at the time that they were in danger of being reoccupied by Russia. I think the fears that they had at the time are very much reinforced by what's going on at the moment. Ukraine is a different issue. We never gave that guarantee to Ukraine, but look, Ukraine has indeed been partially occupied by Russia, and the Baltics today feel very much under threat. So I thought it was, simply extraordinary to take the line that the countries, by the way, that we had gone to war for in 1939, which were then unfree in 1945
What's
and
up, y'all? How's it going? I'm
for 45 years.
and today's video is going to be a little bit different. Today I'm doing an apartment tour, so I thought some people might be interested to see what
them because it was provoking to Russia.
I thought there was.
No, hang on, Anne and then Giles. Anne, go on.
So one thing I thought was quite interesting was trying to steer that line between what are foreign policy discussions and diplomacy, where clearly Simon and I have different views. We perceive a lot of the same events and have different views, and where that becomes a sort of ethical choice. And for me, it came down to a bit of conversation across the programme. Where at one point we were arguing about whether NATO had really gone up to Russia's borders, which I don't really believe reflects the truth, and where it was invited and where it wasn't. And then someone was saying, well, they opened an office in Ukraine. Was a big difference between opening an office in a country and invading it. And this is what we keep coming down to, that we're trying to draw parallels between things that you can argue about. Were they wise? Were they rational? Were they well-timed? These are absolutely the right arguments to be having about Western policy in Russia, and the ones that say, you did this and that's why Putin is behaving this monstrous way.
Giles, the other fault line in the discussion was between between those who felt that we in the West have real values, and they have either no values or corrupted values or values of lesser worth, and those people who think there's a moral equivalence, that they bump off one of their double agents in Salisbury and we bump off ISIS people in Syria with drones. You're for moral equivalence, aren't you?
I think we have very different. I think we have very different values, actually, and there's a lot of the stuff the Russians do that I obviously don't agree with. But I think the whole idea of our sort of self-righteousness about this, that we're whiter than white, and the Russians are completely malevolent in what they do. I just don't see that, and that is a sort of this binary attitude to Russia that we get into, that we've had for a very long time in the Cold War. I just don't buy that at all.
I think more with Anne and Michael than with you, Giles, in terms of the fact that I do think that there is a pretty big distinction in morality between kind of what we would accept and believe was right here and what Putin seems to think is right. But I also think there's a moral requirement that even whilst we are determined, we retain the capacity for self-criticism and the ability to put ourselves in the shoes of our enemies as well as our friends.
Michael, how much truck do you have with the argument that it's partly our fault, either because we didn't hug them at the appropriate moment, or because
he's got no truck with that?
I'm hoping not, or else won't be much of a discussion, will it?
No, we have done some things that were wrong. I think the initiative, which was actually an EU initiative rather than a NATO initiative, to try and embrace Ukraine into either European Union or NATO, was absolutely misconceived. I mean, firstly, there's no way we're going to guarantee Ukraine against an attack by Russia. And secondly, there is a sensitivity about Ukraine which is different from the countries that the Soviet Union occupied after 1945. But in general, I think that we are too willing to blame ourselves. Communism collapsed. It was a completely bankrupt system. It was a system that enslaved not only its own people, but people across Eastern Europe. We should celebrate the fact that our values triumphed, and it's just a great pity, it's a deplorable pity, that the values did not extend to Russia itself.
I just want to draw a line here about values, and one thing we haven't really reflected is there are great Russian values, and they are held by a great number of the Russian people, and they are, and they have been there throughout the history of Russia is sort of bad leadership and worse systems. The values of many of its people are absolutely marvellous, and they're there and they're active today in the human rights activists, in the writers and the filmmakers who are out there criticising Putin and the Putinization of Russia.
They don't view us in the way that we might want them to view us, though. Isn't that true?
No, I think they are people who absolutely depend on, not on us being self-righteous. Of course, who's going to vote, for self-righteousness? But it's an escape hatch, really, I think, Giles, from a moral responsibility to say just because we get things wrong, and we're venal or we make mistakes, that our values fundamentally don't appeal to a lot of people in Russia. They're at the sharp end, and they're the ones we let down.
We were bad winners of the Cold War, and since then our society has been sloshing around with Russian money. We haven't complained about it. Even our football clubs, even my own football club. So there's a massive amount of hypocrisy about this, and I have to say, when we were sneery about whether we should embrace Russia more, perhaps we should have embraced her a bit more.
Isn't there a sense that over time, over history, we get the leaders we deserve?
We get maybe the systems we deserve, and I feel that the last few days have made me feel so grateful to live in a system where we have a representative democracy, where we have a free press, where we have accountability in our leaders, by contrast with Russia. And we've got a rather large number of journalists around the table this evening. And really, all of you, I think, need to feel extraordinarily grateful that you're not in a country where you're likely to be assassinated because you're leading an investigative, an investigation into corruption or crime or whatever it may be. So, to me, the last few days have illustrated an enormous difference in our values.
Basically doing the same thing.
We get the leaders, or countries, I should say, get the leaders they deserve, but only if the information is freely available to them. And I would just add that as perhaps more Michael.
Okay. That's it for this week. From our panel, Anne McElroy, Matthew Taylor, Giles Fraser and Michael Portillo, Oriental dance champion with or without a cobra. And from me, until the same time next week, goodbye.
and class
You
of
can
customers.
download many more BBC Radio 4
distribution
programmes for free. Find
and the
these at
regulatory
bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
Are two segments the same? Can two segments be combined? These are some of the factors that you would, I would suggest, have to take into account. In a moment, we'll do a pass examination question, and you might gain a little bit of an insight into that. Ping produces and sells its products through 3 separate divisions, and there are 2 service departments which carry out admin and service functions. The first service department is the IT.